All right, guys, welcome to the Inklings. And this week we're going to be talking about plot.
One of the something that should be simple, but it's not. Never is.
It's honestly one of the hardest things to really define.
Mhm.
As we are kind of struggling before recording this episode, it's like, how would you help somebody come up with plot? Like, how would you help somebody do some of that? And I was kind of sitting back realizing, I'm like, well, we kind of went through the basically you have the big main three of making a story.
Mhm.
You have world building, you have characters, and you have plot. Obviously, all three of those come together to make what makes a story.
Mhm.
And I kind of put it in the order that it came, is order of importance almost. Because to me, world building is one of the most important things because it builds the world. And I would know from my experience of trying to morph the world around a character, it just doesn't work as well. So having the world and having a setting that you have in place and then inserting your characters, and then once you start coming up with that conflict or different things that are happening, the idea of plot becomes a lot easier as you're navigating within the confines of something you've already established. So, obviously, plot kind of comes naturally, I would say, or an idea of it would come as you're thinking of your world building, of your characters, or some of the things that what are their bents? What are they leaning towards?
Well, and a lot of plot too is it's something we kind of talked about a little bit in the last episode, but it's really easy to want to. I know exactly start to finish how this is going to go. Um, that's not how most plots work. I guess it can happen, you know, there's the possibility, but at least in my own experience with writing, um, you get this spark of an idea, you know, whether it's, as Brandon was saying, from the world, a character, whatever, you get this little spark of an idea where, okay, this is kind of, a bare bones skeleton, and I like it and that's what I'm going to run with. And then as you continue, you kind of embark on that journey
Yeah.
with that character. Things start to fill in the cracks.
Yeah. And that's partially where the editing process comes in because I've edited and re-edited my stuff over and over and over again because of different nuances that change with the plot.
Yeah.
Obviously, writing a story, especially a longer one, it takes a lot of time and effort.
Yeah.
Um, it's not going to be I sit down and I pen it all in one go and then it's done.
That'd be impressive, though.
That would be impressive. But simply that's not really how that works. Coming up with plot, I would say, is almost like a process.
It's an understatement.
Just like character arcs and character development is also a process because you're also learning the quirks of the character as you're writing them as well. I mean, sure, you have ideas to start with, but how they interact with other characters, how they interact with the world around them, that can impact some of that. And also can lend itself into plot. So, I guess going into kind of our short story, I know we kind of briefly touched on it before. So our idea is it kind of goes alongside of some of the more common tropes that you see of plots in stories. So I'll rattle off a couple that I thought of. So you have some plots that are catered toward revenge, defeating a big bad, so a big enemy or villain or something like that. Saving people, country, world, whatever it is. It can be romance, it can be survival, it can be a journey and return, it can be tragedy, it can be rags to riches. Those are just some of common tropes.
Well, it's important to note a lot of the times in a story, you're going to have a combination of these tropes. You might have a journey that involves saving somebody, a tragedy that involves romance,
and,
all of these.
And some of these can lend itself to also character development.
Yeah.
So you can utilize some of these to develop character. which is like subplots into main plot, and that's where you get like main themes and different
Absolutely.
aspects of plot. And obviously, so like one of the focal points of our story. So the main underlying arching plot is survival. So you have the character, which is the Arctic Fox, basically trying to survive after basically experiencing tragedy with their family and trying to forge a path ahead. And then part of some of that. So obviously that's part of the journey. It's survival. And another aspect, and this goes toward the character development side, is there's also a journey, but of self-discovery. So a journey of self-discovery, not just journey as in the physical, but also inside.
Yeah.
So that's kind of also what applies. And that's kind of the bare bones working plot of our story.
Right.
And it is really helped along. Obviously, part of the world building episode, I wrote the cards and it kind of lended itself into a plot. And I did that kind of intentionally to kind of put us in a direction. But you can come up with these things on your own as well. But having a setting, characters, it really helps into creating this plot.
Right.
And then there's aspects of the plot, and I'll go into kind of what makes up a plot. And you could even apply this to character development as well, because it works much the same way. So you have 5 main elements that you have with plot. You have your exposition or your background information, your starting point. You have a rising action, so something that's happening as you're going through the story. You have your climax, your tipping point of what's the resolution of said conflict or whatever it is. And then the falling action, the fallout of that climax of what happened. And then your resolution. So how do things resolve? How do you tie up loose ends? How do you end the plot, basically? And that's plot in a nutshell. But obviously, that's a lot simpler than what it actually is to create it.
Right.
Like, what do some of those tying up of loose ends look like? What do some of these other things look like? Well, messy.
Especially if you've got a big, complicated story. You know.
There's storyboards, and like I think of the image or whatever where you have like a map, okay, and you have like pictures with like thumbtacks in the map, and then you tie strings. Well, this is here, and this is here, and this is here, and then all of a sudden you have a carpet on your wall.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's how complicated things can get. Obviously, you can simplify it. You don't have to have some bizarrely outrageous plot.
And again, maybe this is just personal preference for me, but you probably don't want a carpet on your wall.
No.
Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for either expectations that are too high with a resolution that just isn't going to live up to it, or just a resolution that you can't come up with because you're so lost.
There's so many loose ends that you just can't tie together.
Yeah. And so I would argue it's better to have fewer thumbtacks on the map than
like for us, we're kind of focusing in on, well, at least for our short story, survival, journey. There's journey in 2 aspects, but it's 2 things.
Right.
And that's relatively, obviously we're complicating it a little bit just because that's us. But there's things that you can do. Like, for example, what my initial plan for my story is, well, I wanted to start with a journey because I'm like, well, Lord of the Rings is awesome. They have Fellowship of the Ring, and then they kind of go off and on their journey or whatever, in the conflict or whatever. Obviously, you have the big bad, in Sauron in The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
So a lot of my stuff emulated a lot of what Tolkien did. So let's go on a journey. But I'm going to do it a little bit different. Me, my 5th grade brain saying, I'm going to do it different. I'm going to write as if I'm the character and experience the same things as I'm coming up with them on the fly. Fast forward a bit. Yeah, that was a mistake. It was cool in the moment. Had no sense of direction at all whatsoever. That was my character trying to forge and make a world instead of the other.
Just to make sure that I'm clear with that, like, you didn't really have an outline for what the world
No, there was no outline of the world, nothing. I came with it on the spot.
Because, the idea of I'm going to go on the journey with the character isn't an intrinsically bad idea. In fact, I would encourage it. But again, you need to have some sort of baseline.
You have to have a baseline of where you're at, what are your surroundings, how does your character interact with the world, as opposed to how does the world react around the character.
Right. And it's this idea that, you're taking this journey with the character, but you're not the character. So how does their personality, like you said, interact with the world, its culture, its people, all of those things.
And obviously that's something, it's pretty elementary, I would say, but for me, I learned it a little bit later on where it's like, yeah, I did that wrong. So lots of edits later, and I still haven't corrected everything, but that's kind of some of the direction that you can get for some of the plot. And obviously I've created an underlying plot line of my story thus far. And I'm kind of caught in a rut right now, which is why I haven't really been working on it much, because I'm trying to remedy all my previous mistakes and trying to make them all fit. So I'm trying to tie up loose ends at the beginning because I have an ending in place that I need to tie back to the beginning.
Sure.
And since I was already a good chunk of the way through before I realized my mistake, it took a little bit of time to fix. So that's why coming up with this stuff before you start is a good idea. Anyway.
Yeah, so, looking at my own story and my own plot, I took a little bit of a different approach in the sense that I did have a basic idea for the world. Obviously, it wasn't, super fleshed out at the time, but I knew I wanted it to be a fantasy world, and I wanted to lean more into the whimsical side of it, which is something you probably heard me say whimsical on this channel more than you're comfortable with, but too bad. And so a lot of it was, that means I'm open to doing more imaginative things. Like, if something sounds kind of fun, and maybe even if it's a little goofy, like, I don't care, it's going in there. Because the idea was, this is a world that was created by children. So how does a kid's brain work? It's not going to be necessarily this, super political high fantasy world, because that's not how a kid's brain works. It doesn't mean that stuff doesn't naturally, implement itself at some point within the world, but that wasn't my focal point when creating. And then I wanted to start from a place of tragedy. So the book opens with a tragedy, which then sets off the character arc for the main protagonist and eventually leads them into the journey that does eventually go into the underlying plot of not only saving the world, so you've got that trope, but also self-discovery, coming to terms with the pain and kind of reconciliation in that. So you've got all of those little pieces there.
And obviously, I think with both of our starts, because both of ours start with tragedy.
Yay!
It's part of like the exposition, some of the background information that you get as you're entering into the story. So obviously, mine is gradually revealed over time.
The tragedy, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have a starting point, and obviously, there's several tragedies that happen throughout the course of the story. but like the main one gets revealed as the prologue of each coming book.
Sure.
Or at least that's the idea I have behind it. I haven't even finished one book yet, so I have to get to that point but basically it's a dream sequence is what my thing is, because it's back in remembering.
Yeah.
Back in remembering. You remember a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until you come to terms with what happened. Kind of similar to, I think, how yours ends up ending with coming to terms with everything.
Right, but on the flip side, my tragedy is it's not revealed over time. It's revealed right away. Like, you see the full brunt of what it is because it's so important to the main characters, at least the start of their arc, of his arc.
And both of our arcs are both like self-discovery.
Yes.
For both of our characters. My character kind of feels alone, out of place.
Oh, yeah, so does mine. Look at that.
So it's very similar. Like, we follow similar tropes, but yet it has very different plots for the direction of it.
And very different execution, too.
Yeah.
Which is the beautiful thing about plot and about storytelling in general. Is
it could be the same thing, but you can repaint it in a way that makes it completely different.
You see all these similar tropes, they're tropes for a reason, in almost every single story, whether it's a book, movie, whatever. But you see a different underlying plot. You see the execution differently every single time, which is what makes it such a fun medium to explore and take part in.
And then hopefully, as we're going through our process with our short story, and we'll start writing that actually pretty soon. So what we'll do, I think, for the next video is what we're going to do is help start. Like, that's one of the hardest things I think sometimes to do is, how do I start? How do I start writing a story? Like, do I start with a prologue? Do I start with, like, what does that exposition and stuff look like? How do I implement that? And obviously, we've already kind of given you ideas of what our start or some of the backstory behind our character is. And it'll lend itself into kind of the beginning of what we would do for the story. Now, whether that takes shapes of, do we want to have it in both mind and body? Which would be a little bit interesting to see how they differ from before, like pre-tragedy or post-tragedy, and different things. But, well, again, that's something that you'll learn as you're writing. So we'll start with something, and then eventually we'll get to an editing episode, or when we edit, because editing happens. It's a necessary
one of the
thing.
most important parts, but it's also like my least favorite part. Because, the first draft, when you're starting to write, that's the fun part. And then you go back and you start rewriting and you start looking at all the mistakes and all the typos and all the issues and the plot holes. And you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible writer.
But that happens to everybody.
It happens to everybody.
So, I've lost track how many times I've re-edited my story.
Oh my gosh. Brandon.
I think it's more than 50.
Yeah.
Easily.
It's funny, this week, speaking of editing, I was looking back on my own story. And I'm in the third draft of it right now. So you'd think I'd be pretty happy with like the first few chapters. Guess who decided to scrap chapter 3 and just start rewriting it from the ground up? Yeah, and it's just like, and now I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay. And it all came down to, there was one scene in there that I was like, I'm just not happy with. So I'm going to rewrite the whole darn thing. And then, you start rewriting and you're like, well, I think this could be better too. So then you change it and then you get stuck in a rut because you don't know how you're going to progress.
I mean, that's kind of what happened for me. I had a filler. I had a filler in place prologue.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I had to do it for like creative writing and like school or whatever. I didn't come up with the one at the time. So I'm like, all right, filler. This is the filler. Didn't like it, but then I came up with an idea, rewrote the whole thing, changed everything, and I'm like, now it's okay. It still could use some work, but I'm relatively happy with it, which I hardly ever do with anything I have.
Yeah.
So, again, it's this idea of you gradually reveal little bits at a time. and obviously it's tragic, so yippee. But anyway, so this is kind of hopefully a little bit of a starter for a plot. I know we don't really have a game or anything. We're kind of giving our own little bits and pieces of advice from what we've done on some of the things that we're planning on doing for a story. And hopefully, as we're writing it and talking things out with you guys, you'll be able to walk with us through the process of what exactly is plot, or just kind of joining us on the journey as we write and do basically create the short story. And I think the plan for this is we'll eventually have it on sale down below when we're finished with it, which would be cool. And I know
$100 for a copy.
not quite that.
Okay, well, ruin the
But
fun.
I know for a fact that both Jonathan and I will probably have physical copies
Yeah.
to start with, and we'll probably eventually put it on for sale as soon as I figure out how to do the whole story. I probably have to create it.
I'll help you.
Yeah.
I've messed around with it a little
Okay.
bit before, so I have a little bit of an
Okay.
idea. So
he knows more than I do. So yeah. But again, like plot, we'll figure it as we go.
So stay tuned for that.
So stay tuned. Yeah. So that'd be cool. And then we'll possibly come up with, I don't know, we'll probably do poems or something next.
Yeah.
Just interesting, fun little things.
So
Come up with some poems.
Get excited because the Inklings, they're not going anywhere after the
Yeah.
short story stuff.
No, this short story it starts with a bang, and it's only going to continue.
Yeah.
So stay tuned, and we'll catch you guys later.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. See ya.